Hello everyone, and thanks so much for taking the time to check out this video. For today's viewer requested presentation, I will be turning my attention to the ever controversial question, is the SKS pattern carbine obsolete? As context for this video, rarely a day goes by that I do not receive some version of the following three questions. First, is the SKS viable for combat or personal defense in the modern era? Second, why might someone choose an SKS for combat or personal defense in the modern era? And third, what if anything can be done to the SKS to maximize its functionality for practical or tactical purposes? Well, you asked for my opinion and I'm going to give it to you. My opinion is my opinion alone, so take this all with a grain of salt, but other than that, let's dive in. Right off the bat, I need to come clean with you guys about one thing. The title I chose for this video, Is the SKS Obsolete?, isn't exactly what we're talking about today. What we're really talking about here is viability, and those two terms are not mutually exclusive. To illustrate how something can be both obsolete and yet still viable, let's use the example of automobiles. The Ford Model T, I think we can all agree, is obsolete compared to modern vehicles. It's out of date and no longer in general use. That's what obsolete means. That said, it's still technically a viable means of transportation. If I woke up this morning and saw that the Ford Escape in my driveway had magically transformed into a street-legal registered Ford Model T, I'm not calling out of work this afternoon. I'm just going to leave a little bit early. That 100-year-old Ford Model T is still capable of working successfully for its intended purpose. That's what viable means. Had I woken up to see a horse-drawn chariot in my driveway, okay, that would have been a different story. That's an example of when something can be both obsolete and no longer still viable. So the SKS is kind of like the Ford Model T in that last example. Is it obsolete? Yes, it is. It's out of date and no longer in general use. That's the dictionary definition of obsolete. Now, nowhere in that definition does it say that obsolete means useless or non-viable. So is the SKS viable? Also, yes. It has serious drawbacks, which we will discuss at length throughout this video. However, it is still fundamentally capable of working successfully in combat or defensive related contexts. So let's get a little more specific now and talk about what makes the SKS obsolete and what makes it viable. In terms of what makes it obsolete, this is pretty straightforward. It is no longer in general use, it is in limited use. In the modern era, the SKS is exclusively used by non-state actors, irregular forces, rear echelon elements of third world countries, and civilians. The SKS has not been generally issued since the 20th century, and there are no optimized SKS derivatives in general service. Additionally, the SKS is fundamentally out of date. It uses a fixed internal magazine that is charged by Mauser-style stripper clips. It uses a straight grip stock and has no provisions for optic or accessory mounting. It relies on notch and post iron sights as the only means of aiming. All of these are out-of-date features that have been phased out of general issue fighting rifles for generations now. But now let's talk about viability. The SKS is a semi-automatic carbine chambered in a common intermediate rifle cartridge. It is simple, durable, and extraordinarily reliable. It's accurate enough to effectively engage targets within the ranges expected from an intermediate carbine, and it happens to be one of the most combat-tested weapon systems in human history. Those certainly aren't all the features I would expect in a modern fighting rifle, but we've definitely got a lot of our essential bases covered. There isn't really a whole lot of room for debate regarding the viability of the SKS because there's literally people using SKSs in modern combat in the Middle East and North Africa today. If you were to find yourself on the streets of Damascus, fully kitted with an IOTV, Kevlar, a brand new XM5 wearing an XM157, and you start taking effective fire from 3 dudes on a rooftop with Type 56 carbines, you aren't going to debate the viability of the enemy's weapon system. You're either going to take cover or you're going to die, and that's what viability looks like. So if you're with me so far, we've established that the SKS pattern carbine is both obsolete and still viable. It's far from the best choice out there, but it is a choice. So now let's talk about why someone would make that choice to rely on the SKS as a primary defensive rifle. Again, I think this is easy stuff. As far as I'm concerned, there's exactly 3 reasons why someone would choose an SKS, and they all stem from a shortage of resources. People who choose an SKS either have a shortage of freedom, a shortage of money, or a shortage of rationality, or possibly a combination of all 3. So let's break it down. If a person has a shortage of freedom, that means they live in a jurisdiction in which their access to more capable weapon systems than the SKS is restricted. It may just be that the SKS pattern carbine is genuinely the most effective weapon system that those people can legally acquire. Honestly, that's a great reason to go with an SKS. If your other options were a lever action rifle or a sharpened stick, congratulations, the SKS was the right choice. So good on you, and I'll see you in the optimization section. If a person has a shortage of money, it probably means they already own an SKS and can't afford to buy something different. Or they live in a region in which the SKS happens to be cheaper than more capable weapon systems. That latter condition used to be very prevalent in the United States, although these days average sale prices of surplus SKSs are pretty much right in line with entry-level AR-15s, so unless you get an SKS privately for a great deal, it's probably not a super realistic situation for Americans to find themselves moving forward. That said, it recently came to my attention that there are actually several other countries in addition to the United States. And in some of those countries, an SKS might be financially attainable, whereas more capable weapon systems are not. Again, if that's the situation you find yourself in, good on you. Financial constraints are real, and if you can afford an SKS but you can't afford something better, SKS is probably a really good choice. Finally, let's talk about the fun one, the shortage of rationality. I'm going to spend a little extra time on this one because it could be a sensitive topic. I certainly hope not. That's not my intention. However, to be honest, I do think this is probably the most common factor for most people who choose SKSs as defensive rifles, particularly in the United States. So it's my opinion that American gun culture, to include most facets of internet gun culture, exhibits an overwhelming tendency to relate to firearms more symbolically than literally. Put simply, we tend to focus more on what firearms mean rather than what firearms are. We see this in gun control movements all the time, in which the language of regulation often ignores mechanical realities of firearms and instead focuses on fear-based symbolic interpretations of cosmetic features. The meaningless term assault weapon is a perfect example of this. The thing is, I don't think the antis are the only ones with a tendency to see firearms through a less than rational symbolic lens. They might be unique in the destructive divisiveness of their particular interpretations, but not in the fundamental practice itself. Many firearm enthusiasts, particularly curio and relic enthusiasts like myself, also exhibit symbolic relationships with firearms. How many of you have purchased a firearm based on its use in a movie, video game, or book? How many of you have firearms which you purchased due to their association with a particular historical event or period in history? How many of you have firearms which are family heirlooms? No need to be shy here. I just described 90% of my personal collection. The fact is, many of us own and value firearms, not based on their objective mechanical properties, but because they make us feel nostalgic or connected to something bigger than ourselves. And that's okay. In fact, I think it's probably one of the healthiest ways in which a person can relate to firearms. Despite all the anti-gun owner rhetoric prominent in my country, the fact is that in addition to being a gun owner, I'm actually something of a pacifist, at least in the sense that I consider violence to be an extremely undesirable last resort. Truth be told, I just want to sit around with old guns, wax poetic, tell stories, and reflect on the nature of the human experience while staring at patinaed steel. And I think that's okay. What is not okay is failing to check all of that at the door when we start talking about the practical application of firearms in those undesirable life or death situations I just alluded to. For people lucky enough to have little or no context in that realm, it can be hard to distinguish between those symbolic and literal relationships, and sometimes wires get crossed. What that can look like is well-intended but ultimately foolish thoughts like, I like this gun, therefore it's a good gun for me to defend myself with. Or, the best gun for me is the gun I'm most comfortable with. That is not how the world works. The best gun for you is the most mechanically capable weapon system you have access to and are physically capable of operating. If you have chosen not to become comfortable with that weapon system, that's a personal choice, but please don't delude yourself into believing that it's a rational choice. As a brief caveat, I will say there's something to be said about the relatively small number of usually older individuals who are highly trained on a specific obsolete yet still viable weapon system. If you carried an M14 on 3 tours through Vietnam, I get it. If you jumped out of helicopters in Rhodesia with an FAL, I get it. If you kicked indoors in Fallujah with an M16A2, I get it. If you fired 1,500 rounds through an SKS on the flat range, take a step back, think about your priorities, and imagine what it would be like to have that rifle be the only thing standing between you and oblivion. If you ultimately choose to prioritize meaning over function, honestly, I can get that. I'm guilty of it in my own life in more ways than one. The takeaway here is be honest with yourself and make conscious, informed decisions that you can stand by. So that was a bit of a tangent, but I hope it was helpful to some of you. Now we're going to get into the final segment of this presentation, in which we're going to be talking about what modifications can be made to an SKS to maximize its capabilities. And that's where we're going to start talking about this guy here. I'm going to be showing you my take on the modernized SKS. So really quickly, got to rattle off a couple of disclaimers. Disclaimer 1, the rifle I'm showing you today, this guy should be interpreted as a proof of concept rather than a recommendation. I am not endorsing any of the specific components I chose to use on this build. Rather, I am endorsing the functions which they provide. Disclaimer 2, for me, this is all a thought experiment. I love the SKS with all my heart. Viewers of my channel know this, but make no mistake, if I hear a bump in the night, I am not personally reaching for an SKS, optimized or otherwise. I'm grabbing something that looks a little bit more like this. Third disclaimer. I'm talking about firearm modifications here, but the modifications I've been describing violate the YouTube community standards in any way. Additionally, I'm not providing any instructions on any modifications I've provided. YouTube, you can yourself. YouTube, please don't take away my 3 cents of ad revenue per week. Fourth and final disclaimer. I'm a U.S. citizen and resident, and therefore 18 United States Code Section 922R applies to me when modifying an imported Chinese SKS pattern carbine. The rifle I have assembled for this video fully complies with federal law and of the 14 components identified by the ATF as pertaining to 922R compliance. My build has exactly 10 components of foreign manufacture. I have substituted the original trigger, sear, hammer, and gas piston with parts of U.S. manufacturer. You're a joke, ATF. Please leave my dog alone. Now that we've appeased the tyrants, let's get back to the good stuff. So this is my take on what an optimized SKS should look like. There are certainly other ways of getting to a similar destination, but conceptually, I think this is more or less what we're looking for. So let's break it down. So first things first, we got a 16-inch barrel. I used a Chinese commercial paratrooper for this build, but it's easy enough to cut down a 20-inch barrel. Why would you do that? Well, because a shorter barrel has more pros than cons. First and foremost, it's lighter and handier. Second, it's a stiffer barrel, which should contribute to better accuracy. All of those are pretty good things. What do we lose? Essentially, nothing. 7.62 by 39 is a fast-burning cartridge that does great out of a 16-inch barrel. Ever hear of the AK? Compared to 20 inches, we only lose about 2% of our velocity and about 4.5% of our kinetic energy. As the great Paul Harrell says, that's a difference, but not enough of a difference to make a difference. With a shorter barrel, we do lose a little bit of heat sink capability, but this is a semi-automatic rifle with a fixed 10-round magazine, not an RPK. We don't need the barrel to be a heat sink. It's going to be fine. I just brought up the magazine, so let's talk about that next. Some of you might be surprised to see that I opted to keep the fixed 10-round magazine. Some of you who've seen my other videos might not be so surprised. For me, the deciding factor is reliability. Extraordinary reliability is one of the key factors which has preserved the viability of the SKS pattern carbine, and the last thing I'm going to do is compromise that by messing with the feed system. One tenet that I hold dear in the realm of gunsmithing is you must know and respect the left and right limits of the weapon system you're working on. If I had set out in this project the way so many others before me have in trying to turn an SKS into an AK, I would have gotten the same result that 98% of those people got, which is a really, really disappointing AK. I didn't set out to transform the SKS into something that it's not. I set out to support the SKS in being the best SKS it could be, and sometimes that means knowing to leave well enough alone. Don't get me wrong, duckbill magazines can be a whole lot of fun on the flat range, but in the real world, they introduce a glaring failure point on an otherwise bomb-proof system. Yes, stripper clip feeding is a net detraction. However, it's not without a couple of perks too, and ultimately it's less of a detraction than compromising durability and reliability. I don't want a feeding system that works on the best day. I want a feeding system that works on the worst day. And if you're looking at an SKS, this is your feed system right here. Also, controversial opinion, speed reloads are way more important in movies than they are in real life. Reload from cover, pick your shots, and have confidence that your rifle is going to keep chugging along even when things get unpleasant. Moving back to the barrel now, obviously you can see I removed the bayonet. Chinese cruciform bayonets look cool and make for a decent screwdriver, but aside from that, they're basically dead weight, so it's an easy way to just slim this down a little bit. So obviously the huge change here is going to be the stock, and there's a lot to say about this stock. First off, the product itself, for anybody who cares, is the Fab Defense UAS SKS Complete Chassis System. Feel like they could have used less words, but that's what this is called. Remember, I'm not endorsing products here, only capabilities. I don't yet know how much I like this stock. I need way more time with it, and there's a couple of points of concern and some things that I am pretty impressed by. So if you're interested, I'll keep you updated, but for the moment, let's get back to talking about the capabilities this stock provides, not necessarily who made this particular one. First off, whenever possible, folding butt stocks are awesome. The only thing better than cutting unneeded length off of the front of the weapon is cutting unneeded length off the back of the weapon. This creates an extremely compact carbine package, which is pretty cool. Next, this stock is made of polymer. Polymer can be lighter, stronger, and more weather resistant than wood, and there's probably a reason that all modern weapon systems utilize polymer furniture. I will say I'm not the biggest fan of polymer rails. I prefer aluminum rails. However, I do prefer polymer rails to no rails at all. And that segues us very nicely into the really important stuff, which is the fact that this particular chassis system supports enablers, and enablers are ultimately what distinguish modern weapon systems from obsolete weapons. There are 3 enablers in particular which will transform your SKS from an obsolete weapon system to a more competitive weapon system. Those are going to, of course, be a sling, an optic, and a light. You cannot remember those 3, just remember that without them, you will be shit out of luck. S-O-L, sling, optic, light. Sling is easy. We got these nice QD points built into the chassis. So we can go ahead and go with our nice little 1 point here, or if circumstances require, we can always come up here and pull that into a 2 point. Super modern. Yes, the canvas straps will technically work, but a modern system like this is going to be that much better. So optic is next, and I cannot emphasize enough just how important the optic is. If you can do one thing to modernize or optimize your SKS, just find a way to put an optic on it. In my opinion, the best way is to have one of those rear sight mounted Picatinny adapters. However, literally anything is better than no optic. Use one of those sketchy receiver covers. Duct tape the optic to the barrel if you have to. The takeaway here, get an optic on the rifle. One of my biggest pet peeves in the world of small arms is when people defend iron sights in such a way that betrays the fact that they have never shot at anything except for papered steel at well-lit square ranges. Iron sights are great for that. When the sun goes down and your heart rate goes up, that all goes out the window. Iron sights in the dark are essentially useless. Illuminated reticle optics at night are very effective. Iron sights are extremely difficult to use when your arms are tired, your adrenaline is dumping, and you're hallucinating from sleep deprivation. Single aiming point optics like prisms, red dots, scopes, what have you, are so much easier to use under such challenging circumstances. This simple act of adding an optic to an SKS increases its capabilities tenfold. And if you don't know, now you know. I greatly prefer the M4A1 to the SKS for practical purposes. However, if I had to choose an SKS with a $100 Chinese red dot or a Geisley Super Duty with $300 Daniel Defense iron sights, I'm choosing the optic every single time with zero hesitation. Sorry for beating a dead horse here, but if you take nothing else away from this video, optics are everything. And the last enabler is light, and that's super simple. Observant viewers may have noticed that on Earth it's dark approximately half of the time, and spoiler alert, undesirable situations in which someone might need a weapon to include combat disproportionately take place during those dark periods, sometimes called nighttime. The takeaway here is having a white light on your weapon is super useful. Pay $500 for a Surefire on an Arisaka mount, or hose clamp your junk drawer flashlight to the handguard. I do not care. As long as there's a white light source somehow stuck to your gun, you are in much better shape than you were before. And that's it for enablers, really nothing too crazy. One thing I should mention is there's probably a conversation to be had about muzzle devices, and adding a good flash suppressor would probably be a pretty good idea. I didn't feel like threading the barrel of this guy simply to use as a prop for a video. However, if I intended to actually use this in a real life practical role, I probably would have. So let's summarize. My opinion is that if your goal is to optimize the SKS, you should probably leave the core action alone to include the magazine. If you don't like that, I would encourage you to go back to section 2 of this video and question why you chose an SKS in the first place. What you can do, however, is find a way to set up the best sling, optic, and light setup so you can manage, because if you get those, you're off to a really good start. Chopping the barrel to 16 inches and getting a folding buttstock will result in a much handier package, but are ultimately less important than the aforementioned enablers. Losing the bayonet is also an easy way to drop a little bit of weight. Finally, polymer stocks are probably a good idea, but to be honest, my main appeal with this particular stock was the mounting options. As long as you can find a way to securely attach a sling, optic, and light, I wouldn't talk somebody out of using an original wooden stock. They work fine. All right, everybody, that's the video. And as usual, I hope you found it helpful or at the very least entertaining. If you got any questions, comments, or bones to pick with me, the comments below are there for you. And I'm proud to be in a position where I still respond to or at least acknowledge the vast majority of comments I receive. If you do disagree with me and the opinions I've shared here today, that's perfectly fine. I'm always receptive to consider other perspectives. And if you make a really articulate point, which I did not consider, I'll probably pin your comment to the top. For friends of this channel, new and old, if you're looking for ways to support the channel, the best thing you can do is always to like the video, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I should also note that having recently hit 1,000 subscribers, some of you may start to see ads popping up on my videos. I'm very new to this, so please let me know if at any time these ads appear in such a way that detracts from your experience as a viewer. That is not the intention here. If I can make a couple of bucks doing what I love, I will jump at that chance. But ultimately, that's not why I'm here, so just let me know. Lastly, stay tuned for the stripper clip giveaway, which should be coming soon, as well as some additional SKS and non-SKS related content. Thanks everyone for watching. Hope you have a great rest of your day.